If you've seen my top 15 best James Bond films of all time, then, well, it's time to hear about the worst 10. And if you haven't seen that video yet, go see those videos. I put it into 2 parts. Now, bear in mind that I really like some of these films in this worst of list, and some of them don't really deserve to be on there, but unfortunately I already have my top 15, so these are the 10 remaining James Bonds. And to be honest, there's only 2 James Bond films I actually dislike. So let's get into it. So my number 10 of the worst James Bond films is Octopussy. And I really enjoyed this Roger Moore one. I thought it had a lot of good action, it was a pretty unique story, and it was just really fun to watch. Sure, it might be a little goofy seeing James Bond in a clown suit, but hey, he was in a circus. It makes sense. There's a circus in this movie. I really have little qualms with this movie. The henchman is really badass in this one. I think the only thing that's so borderline ridiculous that it keeps it from being any higher than 4 stars for me is the fact that, yeah, the whole airplane sequence at the end of Octopussy. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just see that scene alone, and yeah, it's really weird. My number 9 of the worst James Bond films is another Sean Connery film, and yeah, it's You Only Live Twice. Now bear in mind, I still really enjoy this. This movie would get about 4 stars from me. I love that the setting is in Japan, and it kind of resembles, yeah, there's a lot of parallels with The Man with the Golden Gun in this one. Now this is where the Sean Connery films started to get a little bit more ridiculous, but they're still not as ridiculous as the Roger Moore films at this point. This one had ninjas in it, and yeah, what other James Bond film can say they had ninjas and they trained James Bond to be a ninja? This is also the first time you actually get to see Blofeld, head of Spectre, and he's a bit of a letdown because he's just some evil villain. And the whole thing about trying to turn Sean Connery into a Japanese person is a little weird. Not as crazy as Die Another Day, though. But the shootout at the very end of the film is really great, and it's one of the more memorable shootouts of the James Bond franchise for me. Number 8 is another Roger Moore film, and this one is The Man with the Golden Gun. You got frickin' Christopher Lee as the main villain in this film, a hitman, a guy meant to kill James Bond. The setup is great, there's a lot of great moments in the film, but overall some of it is a bit of a letdown. Especially the eventual climax of the film isn't epic enough, and it isn't a big showdown of like a cat and mouse game. It could have been a lot better. Plus the sheriff from Live and Let Die is in it again, and honestly he's a lot more annoying in The Man with the Golden Gun than he is in Live and Let Die. Alright, my number 7 is yet another Roger Moore film. It is Moonraker, and honestly this is a really fun one. I loved this as a kid. Watching it again, I don't like it as much as I remember liking it. This is when Jaws became a little bit too comical, but I did like that he eventually turns good at the end. The villain is really over the top, and he's trying to be like this aristocrat, but he's very emotionless at the same time, and he's just like, ugh. I do like his plan more than the one from A Spy Who Loved Me. That's because I like space. But there's so much of the film that just falls a little flat for me now that I rewatched it. And it's hard to explain. It's just not as great or not as fun as I remember it, but there's still a lot of really great moments that I still love today. Alright, number 6 should probably be a Roger Moore film, but it's not. It's the one right before Roger Moore first started as James Bond. It's a Sean Connery film, and it's Diamonds Are Forever. It's the last Sean Connery film, and to be honest, the whole structure, the villains, the way the whole thing plays out, it feels more like a Roger Moore film. It's just before Roger Moore started. Granted, it is the one right before Roger Moore started, so it is a nice transition between Sean Connery and Roger Moore. Now, what I do really love about this film, and one of the best parts of the film, is the beginning right before the intro, where Sean Connery is in search for Blofeld, because this is right after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Blofeld had killed killed James Bond's wife. And so now James Bond is out for revenge, and so it picks up right where it left off, and he is out to kill Blofeld, and he's gonna take no shit from anyone else. So it's like, alright, this is a really good start, and then the intro happens, and then right after that it just becomes a bit Roger Moore-ish. I do love the two villains that finish each other's sentences. It's actually, I really enjoy them. They're really fun and entertaining, but at the same time really sinister and really creepy. Honestly, they might be the best part of the film other than the intro itself, well, before the intro. But nevertheless, I'd still give Diamonds Are Forever 3 stars at least. Okay, so we're finally at the bottom 5 worst James Bond films of all time in my opinion. And even though there's only 2 James Bond films that I actually dislike, my numbers 5, 4, and 3, they would still get under 3 stars. So they are a bit disappointing at least. My number 5 is a film that many people believe is easily Daniel Craig's worst James Bond film. I think you all know what I'm talking about, Quantum of Solace. Now, I do have to admit that I actually do like the story. It's another James Bond movie where the Bond girl wants to take revenge on some other villain. And honestly, it's handled really good, and it actually comes full circle by the end of the movie. She's a much tougher Bond girl than I remember, and honestly, I really like her after seeing her again. As I said, I really enjoy the film. It's coming right off of Casino Royale, and so James Bond is really upset. He's really out to kill the person that basically screwed Vesper over. So he's going to leave a trail of bodies as he's searching for the man that betrayed her, while also getting a little bit deeper into the Spectre organization, which doesn't have a name by the end of this movie. Well, finally the name is revealed in Spectre, but in Quantum of Solace they're still an unknown organization. And the whole action sequence at the very end of the film where the house is exploding and the bad guy is coming at James Bond with an axe while the Bond girl is fighting the dictator, and fire and explosions are all over the place, is really epic and easily the best action sequence in the entire film, so at least it built up to that. And James Bond has a complete character arc in this movie that started at the end of Casino Royale and finally came full circle by the end of this movie, so you have to give it some credit for that. Ultimately, I think there's only 2 main issues of Quantum of Solace that keep it from being a 4-star movie, honestly, because it's more of a 2.5 when I take everything in, but if it wasn't for these certain factors, I probably would have given it easily a 4-star. One, the villain isn't that great of a villain compared to the other villains that Daniel Craig has to face off against, and his plan is ultimately very vague, similar to Dr. No, in that it's not easy to grasp. Well, in all honesty, it's not that hard to imagine if you pay attention to the movie, because it does explain the plan, and it does it very, very briefly. But the main issue, the main thing that keeps it from being great, because it would be a great movie if it wasn't for this fact: the close-up, cut crazy, shaky cam. Now, to be honest, this isn't the only James Bond to have shaky cam, but it's the only one to be this dramatic and this distracting. So distracting that I couldn't even tell what was going on at times, and I'm really good at understanding shaky cam most of the time. Yes, there is honestly shaky cam during the other Daniel Craig James Bond movies, but it's so subtle and so few that it's hardly noticeable. In Quantum of Solace, it's like someone's just going like this with the camera. It's annoying, and it keeps the film from being really great, because it probably would have been great if it wasn't for that and a few bad CGI moments. Okay, my number 4 is probably another film you've all been waiting to hear in my worst list. It is the Pierce Brosnan film, and it is Die Another Day. Now look, I can have a bit of a fun time with Die Another Day, And in fact, I feel that there's some things in it that are absolutely great. The whole sequence before the intro, even the intro was pretty unique and fascinating. The fact that James Bond gets captured, tortured, that's really unique to the series. It isn't until the film actually goes to Iceland that it starts becoming a drag and too over the top and too crazy and just too... Why did they think that was good? Everything before that moment was pretty great, or sometimes epic. Pierce Brosnan is still good as James Bond. Halle Berry was good. Even the villains were kind of good, even though they were sometimes over the top and too crazy and just... That doesn't feel like a normal human being whatsoever. The sword fight was absolutely brutal and one of the better James Bond sequences. But Rosamund Pike... this feels like an embarrassment for her. She was fine up until the major reveal that she's a bad girl. But once she's a bad girl, she becomes just as over the top as the main villain. And my God, if the dialogue was bad from The World Is Not Enough, then you're going to think that the dialogue is absolutely atrocious in Die Another Day, because a lot of it is, especially towards the end of the film. Now, this is the one movie that I might get a lot of flack for being in my bottom 10, let alone my bottom 5, but I have to say it. My least favorite Sean Connery film, and ultimately my number 3 worst James Bond film of all time, is Thunderball. I know a bunch of people that do really enjoy this movie, but when it comes to thinking of Sean Connery James Bond films, this is the one I always forget about. I always forget about it, and when I rewatch it again, I just think, it's okay. It's just, I don't know. I never really liked Thunderball all that much. And I'm not sure what the reason is, but maybe it just feels too cliched now that I've seen it again and again. Like, the main villain even has an eye patch. An eye patch. Even though I kind of like that the main Bond girl ends up killing the main bad guy, because ultimately it is a revenge, it does feel a little out of place and a little bit like Ex Machina, you know? It just feels like it comes out of nowhere at the end of the movie. Like, yeah. So yeah, Thunderball, I just really wasn't ever a big fan of it, and I just feel it's one of the bland James Bond films. Okay, I got 2 movies, 2 James Bond films. These are the only ones I truly dislike, and both of them would get a single star for me. There's still enough good things in it to keep it from being a half a star or a 0 star, but these are the only ones that have 1 star when it comes to the James Bond films. My number 2 probably shouldn't even be on this list because it's a knockoff. It's a knockoff James Bond, but it still has Sean Connery as James Bond, and a few different websites still consider it one of the James Bond films, even though it's a totally different production company. It's Orion, the ones that made RoboCop, and a few others. And ultimately, it's a remake of a Sean Connery film that I don't really like that much when it comes to the James Bond films. It's a remake of Thunderball, but it's called Never Say Never Again. So yeah, it's Sean Connery, but it's back when Roger Moore was still James Bond, and so it's a different production company. Sean Connery is much older. It just feels completely off. Feels like it could be a good 80s action film. Like, the action sequences alone feel like something from the 80s. It feels like something that's more Rambo or Commando. But it's James Bond. It feels really out of place. Like, in the beginning sequence, he's like in camo and he's like taking out people like an action hero, and I'm just stunned. Ultimately, I think I like the villain in this film better than the villain in Thunderball. In this one, the Bond girl still kills the main bad guy, but it comes even more out of nowhere. Basically, if you like Thunderball, you're going to hate Never Say Never Again because there's so many different changes, which makes sense because it has to be different a little bit, but you'll probably just not like the changes at all because it's completely, utterly crazy. And a lot of it really doesn't feel like a James Bond film because it's a knockoff James Bond film. And the only reason this is number 2 probably is because this would be too easy of a choice to be the worst James Bond film of all time. My number 1, to be frank, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Yeah, it's the only one where George, is it Lazenby or something like that. It's the only one where he's James Bond, and it's a good thing that it's the only one with him as James Bond, because even though he's pretty good, he doesn't feel like James Bond to me. Like, yes, the other actors did have a unique spin on James Bond, but they still felt like James Bond. George, he doesn't feel like James Bond to me at all. I thought the story was ludicrous, even being a James Bond film, and ultimately it was really boring as well. That doesn't really happen with James Bond films, with me. But I get bored every time I watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Now, many people complain about Quantum of Solace because of the action sequences. You know what? I'd honestly take the action sequences for Quantum of Solace over the action sequences in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I'm being truthful here, because even though On Her Majesty's Secret Service doesn't have shaky cam, it does have the close-up, multiple cuts, multiple different angles with every punch. So much so that you don't even see the actual punches at times. It just feels like just before it punches, it cuts and you're in a totally different angle and you don't see it. This is the first James Bond film to do it, and one of the only James Bond films to honestly do it as multiple times as this one did. And I think many people just forget about that because it's such an older James Bond film. Go back and watch it. I dare you. Watch the action sequences. It's cut up like crazy. I guess it was before its time because that's what all the action sequences nowadays do. The only redeemable quality that On Her Majesty's Secret Service has is the eventual marriage and then the death of James Bond's wife. Yeah, that scene is honestly really good, and even though I didn't feel like there was any chemistry between her and James Bond whatsoever, I still teared up a little bit when she ultimately died at the end of the film and the last words that George Lazenby says. And it's kind of an oddity that I would cry at that moment because, like I said, it didn't feel like they had a good chemistry. It felt like just another James Bond girl in this movie. It wasn't until either the Timothy Dalton films or the Pierce Brosnan films, it wasn't until the last 3 actors that the chemistry between James Bond and the Bond girl seemed to be actually working and actually feel like they developed well enough. And for On Her Majesty's Secret Service, it really needs to have a love story in it to be extremely effective. But it just feels like your typical Bond girl stuff, and it doesn't really work as well as it should. I really never liked it. I never liked On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I probably never will. So that was my top 10 worst Bond films of all time. What is the worst James Bond films you've ever seen? Go ahead and list them in the comments, and I'd be happy to read them and comment about them. As always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was just my opinion.